By January 1945, Leonard Funk had learned the most dangerous sound in war wasn't gunfire, it was silence, the kind that settled over frozen Belgian villages where snow muffled everything and you couldn't hear enemy movement until it was too late, where the absence of noise meant either safety or ambush and distinguishing between them required instincts developed through survival rather than training. And First Sergeant Leonard Funk of Company C, 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division, had developed those instincts through campaigns that had taught him to read terrain and weather and the behavior of men under stress, had taught him that leadership wasn't about rank or heroics but about keeping soldiers alive through decisions made in seconds with incomplete information and consequences that couldn't be undone. Funk was 25 years old, looked older from exhaustion and exposure, had grown up on an Indiana farm where work started before dawn and ended after dark and complaining accomplished nothing, had learned quiet competence from a father who demonstrated rather than explained, who fixed equipment that broke and improvised solutions to problems that didn't have obvious answers, and this rural pragmatism had translated into military effectiveness because farming and soldiering both required doing what needed doing regardless of whether conditions were favorable or resources adequate, required persistence through discomfort and setbacks, required accepting that survival often depended on simple endurance rather than dramatic action. He'd enlisted in 1942, had volunteered for airborne training because paratroopers received extra pay, and because jumping from aircraft seemed no more dangerous than what infantry would face regardless, had discovered he was good at it. Not naturally talented but methodically competent, reliable in ways that mattered more than flash or bravery, the kind of soldier who could be counted on to execute orders without requiring supervision, who could be trusted to make decisions when officers weren't present, who understood that war was primarily about not making fatal mistakes rather than about achieving spectacular successes, and this reliability had led to promotion to First Sergeant, had made him responsible for an entire company's enlisted men, responsible for maintaining discipline and morale and effectiveness, responsible for keeping track of which soldiers were reliable and which needed watching, which were injured and which were just complaining, which could handle stress and which were approaching breaking points. And this responsibility meant Funk thought constantly about his men's survival rather than about personal glory or tactical brilliance, meant his decisions were filtered through calculations about risk and necessity, meant he'd developed an instinct for recognizing when situations were deteriorating before they became irreversible, and this instinct had kept him alive through campaigns that had killed many soldiers who were braver or stronger or better trained, but who'd made mistakes that combat didn't forgive. Normandy had been Funk's introduction to sustained combat, to chaos that exceeded anything training could prepare soldiers for, where paratroopers landed scattered across French countryside in darkness with no clear sense of where friendly forces were or where objectives lay, where the first hours consisted of trying to find anyone from your unit while avoiding German patrols, where organization emerged gradually from confusion as soldiers coalesced around whoever seemed to know what they were doing, and Funk had been one of those anchors around which units reformed because he didn't panic, because he could read maps and navigate by terrain features, because he made decisions quickly enough to maintain momentum without being reckless, and the days following the drop had been continuous movement and small engagements where success meant accomplishing limited objectives without taking casualties that would degrade the units. Effectiveness meant securing positions and holding them against counterattacks, meant learning which hedgerows provided cover and which were death traps, meant understanding how German defenders used terrain and where they positioned weapons and how to approach positions without walking into interlocking fire, and Funk absorbed these lessons because survival required learning, because soldiers who didn't adapt died, because the alternative to continuous improvement was becoming a casualty. Statistic. Market Garden in September had been different, had been an operation planned with optimism about rapid advance and German collapse. An airborne insertion meant to seize bridges and open routes for armored columns to drive into Germany. But the reality had been false hope colliding with German resistance that was supposed to be minimal but turned out to be substantial, had been roads choked with burning vehicles and units unable to link up and objectives that couldn't be held because support didn't arrive, and Funk had learned that bold plans often failed not because soldiers didn't execute but because assumptions about enemy capabilities were wrong, learned that adapting to failure was more important than executing plans that circumstances had rendered obsolete, learned that knowing when to hold positions and when to withdraw was as important as knowing when to advance, and he'd brought his men through Market Garden with fewer casualties than many units because he'd recognized early that the operation wasn't going to succeed as planned and had focused on survival rather than on heroic attempts to accomplish objectives that couldn't be achieved. The Bulge, The German offensive that had begun in December and was still grinding forward in early January had been the worst campaign yet, had been fighting in conditions where cold was as dangerous as German fire, where frostbite disabled soldiers as effectively as bullets, where every movement required extra effort because bodies were sluggish from cold and equipment didn't function properly in freezing temperatures, and German forces had pushed with desperation born from knowing this was their last chance to affect the war's outcome, had attacked with forces that Allied intelligence hadn't detected and along routes that seemed unlikely, and American units had been pushed back, had conducted fighting withdrawals through terrain that favored defenders, had stabilized lines through attrition and determination rather than through tactical brilliance, and Funk had learned that endurance mattered more than tactics when conditions were terrible for everyone and survival meant simply lasting longer than the enemy could sustain attacks, meant holding positions when every instinct said to retreat, meant keeping men functional when cold and exhaustion were grinding down everyone's effectiveness, and he kept his company together through careful attention to small things, making sure soldiers changed socks to prevent frostbite, making sure they ate when food was available, making sure they understood why they were holding positions even when holding seemed pointless. And these small attentions accumulated into unit cohesion that meant his company remained effective when others were falling apart. Holzheim in January 1945 was a village that war had passed through multiple times, a collection of stone buildings damaged by shelling and fighting, streets covered with snow that hadn't been cleared, civilian population evacuated or hiding, silence broken only by wind and occasional distant artillery. The kind of place that seemed abandoned but might contain enemy forces, that required careful clearing because German soldiers defended village buildings with determination, that represented terrain that had to be controlled but wasn't worth casualties if objectives could be achieved through caution rather than aggression. Funk's company was probing forward as part of operations to pressure German positions, to determine where enemy forces were concentrated, to identify defensive lines that would need to be breached by larger forces, and this reconnaissance mission meant moving carefully through terrain where contact was possible but not certain, meant being ready for engagement but not seeking it unnecessarily, meant gathering information while minimizing exposure, and Funk led a patrol forward into Holzheim, expecting to find either empty buildings or small German outposts that could be bypassed or engaged depending on tactical considerations, expecting routine operations that would end with either negative contact reported or brief skirmishes that would force German forces to reveal positions. What he found instead was a German force numbering roughly 90 soldiers occupying multiple buildings, a force far larger than reconnaissance patrols were equipped to engage, a force that had been alerted to American presence and had positioned themselves to ambush the patrol, and Funk's men walked into a situation where they were outnumbered 5-1 and surrounded before they fully understood what was happening, where German soldiers emerged from buildings and positions with weapons, trained on Americans who were caught in the open without cover, and the tactical mathematics were clear. Resistance meant immediate casualties, meant soldiers would die before they could inflict significant damage on German forces, meant the patrol would be eliminated without accomplishing anything beyond alerting Germans to American probing, and Funk made the decision that training and doctrine prescribed, ordered his men to lay down weapons, to comply with German demands, to surrender rather than fight because fighting would be suicide and surrendering at least preserved the possibility of survival, and his men complied because they trusted Funk's judgment, because they understood the situation was hopeless, because staying alive as prisoners was better than dying pointlessly in a village that would be captured by American forces eventually regardless of what this patrol accomplished. The German officer who approached Funk spoke rapidly in German, gave orders that Funk didn't understand beyond their general intention, probably demanding formal surrender, probably asking about other American forces in the area, probably asserting authority over prisoners who would now be transported to rear areas for interrogation and eventual transfer to POW facilities. And Funk responded in English indicating he didn't understand German, tried to keep his expression neutral and non-threatening, tried to project calm acceptance of the situation because showing fear or aggression might provoke violence against his men, and the German officer continued speaking with increasing frustration at the language barrier, gestured with an MP-40 submachine gun that he carried, stepped closer to Funk until the weapon's muzzle pressed against Funk's stomach, emphasized whatever point he was making through physical intimidation that was meant to establish dominance and force compliance even without shared language. Funk laughed. Not mockingly, not as deliberate provocation, just a short involuntary sound that emerged from stress and absurdity, and the fundamental disconnect between the seriousness of being threatened with immediate death and the comic opera of being threatened by someone whose language you didn't understand and whose specific demands remained unclear. Laughed because humans sometimes laugh under extreme stress as a release valve for tension that has no other outlet. Laughed because the situation was objectively ridiculous even though it was also terrifying. And this laugh was brief and died immediately, but its effect was disproportionate to its duration because the German officer interpreted it as mockery or insubordination or American arrogance, interpreted it as disrespect that required response, and the officer's expression shifted from frustration to anger, and his grip on the MP-40 tightened and his finger moved toward the trigger, and Funk recognized with absolute clarity that he'd just made a potentially fatal mistake, that his involuntary laugh had transformed a tense but manageable surrender into a situation where violence was imminent, where the German officer might shoot him simply to reassert authority, where his men would witness their sergeant being executed and would be powerless to prevent it, and this recognition compressed time as Funk's mind accelerated through options and probabilities and consequences in the fraction of a second between recognizing danger and deciding how to respond. And what he recognized was that the German officer had made a tactical error by stepping within arm's reach while his attention was focused on Funk rather than on situational awareness, had made the mistake of assuming that a surrounded soldier who'd surrendered was no longer a threat, had created an opening that wouldn't exist if Funk waited another second, and Funk's decision emerged not from conscious reasoning but from instinct developed through campaigns where hesitation meant death and decisive action created opportunities that careful planning couldn't. And his hand moved without thought, without planning, just moved because movement was the only option that might prevent immediate execution and might create possibilities beyond dying in this village with his men watching. Funk's Thompson submachine gun, which he'd retained when his men surrendered because German forces hadn't yet collected weapons and because as a first sergeant he carried it rather than a rifle, came up fast, rose from low-ready position where it had been pointed at the ground to firing position in a motion practiced thousands of times in training and combat, and his finger found the trigger and the weapon fired a burst that hit the German officer at contact distance, hit him center mass with rounds that killed instantly, and the officer collapsed and the MP-40 fell and Funk was already pivoting toward the next nearest German soldier and, firing, was already moving forward rather than retreating because retreating meant presenting his back to armed enemies while advancing meant maintaining initiative through aggression, meant forcing Germans to react to him rather than giving them time to organize response. And the Thompson fired controlled bursts rather than sustained automatic fire because Funk's training and experience had taught him that short bursts conserved ammunition while maintaining accuracy, that walking fire into targets was more effective than spraying rounds randomly, that magazine management mattered because the Thompson held only 30 rounds and reloading took seconds that could be fatal, and he fired and moved with focus that excluded everything except targets and cover and ammunition state, with awareness of his surroundings compressed into tunnel vision that saw threats and ignored everything else, with the Thompson's recoil and muzzle blast and the smell of burning powder, and the impacts of rounds hitting targets all registering peripherally while his conscious mind tracked only essentials. Magazine nearly empty, need to reload, Germans reacting slowly, their confusion providing seconds of opportunity. The reload happened during movement, happened while Funk was stepping toward cover provided by a stone wall, happened through muscle memory that didn't require conscious thought. Magazine release, spent magazine dropping, fresh magazine from pouch, magazine inserted, bolt released, weapon ready, happened in perhaps 3 seconds that felt longer because time distorted under adrenaline, and German soldiers were shouting and some were returning fire, but their response was disorganized because they'd been relaxed, had believed the tactical situation was resolved, had been standing in open without taking cover because they'd assumed no threat existed, and Funk's sudden violent aggression had created confusion about what was happening, had made some Germans believe they were under attack by a larger force rather than by a single soldier, had triggered instincts to seek cover and identify threats rather than to immediately engage the obvious source of fire, and this confusion bought Funk seconds where he could continue firing without receiving concentrated return fire, could continue advancing while Germans were still processing that combat had resumed, could kill soldiers who were trying to orient rather than trying to shoot back. Funk killed 21 German soldiers in approximately 45 seconds of continuous movement and fire, killed them through combination of surprise and aggression and competence, killed them because he acted while they reacted, because he maintained initiative through forward movement that prevented Germans from organizing effective response, because his Thompson fired faster than German rifles, and because he knew how to use that rate-of-fire advantage, because he trained and fought enough to shoot accurately under stress while moving, and the Germans who didn't die in those first 45 seconds either retreated or surrendered because the tactical situation had reversed completely, because what had been 90 Germans holding 30 American prisoners had become American soldiers recovering weapons and German soldiers recognizing they'd lost control of the situation, and momentum in combat is psychological as much as physical. The side that believes it's winning fights harder than the side that believes it's losing. And German soldiers who moments earlier had been confident captors were now confused and demoralized by casualties they hadn't anticipated and by tactical reversal they couldn't explain, were responding to what they perceived as ambush or reinforcement rather than recognizing that a single American had simply refused to accept defeat. Funk's men, who'd been kneeling with hands visible, who'd been processing the psychological transition from soldiers to prisoners, who'd been calculating survival odds in captivity, found themselves suddenly free to act, suddenly able to recover their weapons which German forces hadn't yet collected, suddenly participants in combat that had restarted without clear signals or coordination, and their response was delayed by seconds of cognitive processing where their understanding of the situation struggled to match what their senses reported, where they moved from despair to confusion to recognition to action, and by the time they'd recovered weapons and were ready to fight effectively, Funk had already changed the tactical outcome through individual action that hadn't waited for coordination or support. The silence that settled after the shooting stopped was different from the silence that had preceded it, was silence of shock rather than anticipation, silence of exhausted men processing, violence rather than silence of snow-covered village waiting for something to happen, and smoke from weapons fire drifted in cold air while snow around bodies showed disturbance, showed where men had fallen and where others had sought cover, showed the physical evidence of 45 seconds that had transformed certain defeat into improbable victory, and Funk checked on his men first, moved among them asking about injuries, ensuring everyone was functional, re-establishing the organizational structure that combat had disrupted, and his men looked at him with expressions mixing relief and disbelief and something approaching awe because they'd been seconds from imprisonment or execution, and now they were free because one man had acted when action seemed impossible, had refused to accept surrender when surrender seemed inevitable, had created an outcome through violence and decisiveness that no one had anticipated, and Funk said little, offered no explanation or justification, just verified that his patrol was intact and that German forces in the immediate area were neutralized and that the mission could continue, and his emotional state was difficult to read because he'd compartmentalized the violence, had filed it in the mental category where combat actions went so they didn't interfere with continued functioning, had moved on psychologically before his men had even begun processing what happened, and this emotional management was survival skill rather than callousness, was necessary because dwelling on violence degraded effectiveness and dwelling could happen later if there was later, and Funk's focus remained on mission accomplishment and soldier welfare because those responsibilities continued regardless of what had just occurred. His men slowly understood as shock faded and minds could process beyond immediate survival. They'd been captured, had surrendered, had been seconds from being marched away to uncertain fates in German captivity, and one decision by their first sergeant had reversed everything, had transformed guaranteed defeat into tactical success through individual action that violated every instinct about prudent behavior in hopeless situations, and this understanding created respect that went beyond rank or formal authority, created the recognition that Funk had risked immediate death to prevent their capture, had acted when action meant probable suicide, had succeeded through combination of skill and aggression and luck that couldn't be predicted or replicated but which had worked in this specific moment, and the story would spread through the regiment and division, would be told and retold with embellishments, would become legend even though Funk himself treated it as simply another day's work. In a campaign full of days where survival required doing things that seemed impossible in retrospect. The Medal of Honor recommendation came through channels over subsequent weeks, was initiated by officers who interviewed survivors and reviewed the tactical situation and concluded that Funk's actions met the criteria for America's highest military decoration, had demonstrated valor above and beyond the call of duty, had risked life voluntarily in circumstances where death was probable, had achieved tactical success that saved American lives through individual heroism that exceeded normal standards of courage and effectiveness. And the citation, when it was finally approved and awarded, described the facts in official language that flattened the chaos and terror and absurdity into professional military terminology, described how First Sergeant Funk had encountered superior enemy forces, had been forced to surrender, had reversed the situation through aggressive action that resulted in 21 enemy casualties and the capture or dispersal of remaining German forces, and the citation made it sound almost routine, made it sound like tactical problem-solving rather than like 45 seconds of violence that shouldn't have worked but did, and Funk's reaction to receiving the medal was uncomfortable rather than proud, was characterized by deflection and humility that seemed almost compulsory, that followed patterns other Medal of Honor recipients displayed where the men who received the decoration were least comfortable accepting recognition for actions they viewed as necessary rather than heroic, as duty rather than valor, as simply doing what the situation required rather than exceeding normal standards of behavior. He never told the story voluntarily, never dwelt on those 45 seconds, never analyzed why he'd laughed or why he'd acted or whether different decisions might have produced different outcomes, just filed the experience with all the other experiences from campaigns he'd survived, just continued serving until the war ended and then returned to civilian life where farming required similar skills, persistence, problem-solving, doing what needed doing regardless of conditions, and the medal stayed in a drawer more often than it was displayed, remained evidence of something that happened but which Funk himself didn't see as defining or as particularly meaningful beyond the fact that his men had survived and the mission had been accomplished and he'd made it home when many hadn't. History would record Leonard Funk's actions at Holzheim as an example of extraordinary heroism, would cite the incident in discussions of Medal of Honor recipients and of combat leadership, would use it as illustration of how individuals can affect tactical outcomes through decisive action under impossible circumstances, but Funk himself would have resisted these interpretations, would have pointed out that he'd acted instinctively rather than heroically, that he'd simply refused to accept that surrender was inevitable when alternative existed even if that alternative was unlikely to succeed, that the laugh that triggered everything hadn't been brave or calculated but just human response to stress, and that the 45 seconds of violence that followed had been ugly necessity rather than glorious combat, had been killing because not killing meant worse outcomes, and that making this sound heroic missed the point, which was that war forced people into situations where heroism and brutality became indistinguishable, where the same actions could be praised or condemned depending on outcomes and perspectives, where survival often depended on willingness to do violence faster and more effectively than the other side, and that none of this was particularly praiseworthy even when it was necessary, was just the reality of war that civilians never quite understood and that veterans rarely discussed because discussing it required revisiting experiences that were better left filed away, and so the story of how Leonard Funk laughed and then killed 21 Germans in 45 seconds would be told by others, would become part of American military heritage, would be studied by historians and soldiers, but Funk himself would remain uncomfortable with the telling, would prefer to be remembered as First Sergeant who'd done his job keeping soldiers alive rather than as Medal of Honor recipient who'd accomplished impossible victory through individual action. And perhaps that discomfort was itself the most honest response to what happened in Holzheim. The recognition that war creates situations where extraordinary violence becomes necessary, and where surviving those situations doesn't make you a hero but just makes you someone who survived. And whether that survival was through luck or skill or decisiveness mattered less than the fact that his men went home, that the mission was accomplished, that 45 seconds of chaos reversed certain defeat into tactical success, and that sometimes in war the line between disaster and victory is nothing more than one man refusing to accept that the situation is hopeless, one involuntary laugh that triggers violence, one decision to act when all logic says surrender is the only rational choice, and history would call it bravery and would award medals and would tell the story for generations, but Leonard Funk would call it doing his job, would call it 45 seconds that happened to work out when they could easily have resulted in immediate death, would call it one day in a war full of days where survival required doing things that seemed impossible until you'd done them, and the fact that this particular impossibility earned recognition while countless other impossibilities remained anonymous didn't change the fundamental reality that war was full of moments where soldiers did things that shouldn't have worked but did, and Funk's moment at Holzheim was remarkable primarily because witnesses survived to report it, because tactical outcomes were significant enough to warrant official attention, because the specific combination of circumstances created a narrative that fit heroism templates. But similar moments happened constantly throughout the war in situations where no one survived to report them or where outcomes weren't significant enough to warrant medals or where the actions were too ambiguous to celebrate. And Funk understood this even if the military and historians didn't, understood that his 45 seconds were representative rather than exceptional, were example of what war required rather than aberration, and that celebrating them missed the deeper truth, which was that war forced ordinary people into situations where survival required extraordinary actions, and that these actions shouldn't be necessary, shouldn't be celebrated, should be recognized as tragic necessities rather than as glorious achievements, and that the real heroism wasn't in the violence but in the willingness to accept responsibility for other soldiers' survival, in the decision to act when action seemed hopeless, in the refusal to quit when quitting seemed rational, and those qualities couldn't be captured in citations or commemorated with medals but existed nonetheless in the daily unglamorous work of keeping units functional and soldiers alive through campaigns where death was common and survival was victory enough. And so Leonard Funk returned to Indiana and farmed and raised a family and lived a quiet life where the Medal of Honor sat in a drawer and the memory of Holzheim remained filed away with all the other memories from the war. And history recorded his actions, but Funk himself moved on because dwelling on the past prevented living in the present. And the present required attention and work and persistence just like the past had, required solving problems with available resources just like war had, required doing what needed doing regardless of recognition or celebration, and perhaps that continuity, that fundamental consistency between wartime necessity and peacetime work, explained why Funk never seemed particularly impressed by his own heroism, why he treated those 45 seconds as just another problem that had required solving, why he laughed at Holzheim not from bravery but from stress and then solved the problem that laughter created through violence that worked not because it was heroic but because it was fast and decisive and competent, and history would remember the heroism while Funk remembered the work, would celebrate the violence while Funk remembered the necessity, would tell the story while Funk remained silent, and maybe that silence was the most honest response possible to war's demands,